Hello and welcome to another lesson from our series on the book of Exodus. In this lesson, which is entitled God Instructs His People, we'll be looking at the Ten Commandments as they were given in the first setting there in Exodus chapter 20. Now, we need to start with a little discussion about the role of the Ten Commandments. Some people look at the Bible and they mistakenly suggest that the Old Testament is a book of law that gives you rules that you should follow if you would have relationship with God, salvation, righteousness, etc. And then they say the New Testament is the book of faith. Jesus comes, and when you place your faith in Jesus, you then have salvation, a relationship with God. However, when you look at the Old Testament more closely, the Old Testament is a lot more than just a book of law. In fact, Paul in the New Testament frequently refers to the faith of Abraham and the patriarchs as an example to the faith that Christians should aspire to. In fact, he says that it is the keeping of the law, as we'll look at in a few minutes. It is the keeping of these rules that is evidence of our faith. The keeping of the law in the Old Testament was meant to, it should be understood as the mark of the righteous, not the means to righteousness. Let me say that again. The keeping of the law should be understood to be the mark of righteousness, the evidence of covenant relationship, and not the means by which you earn righteousness or covenant relationship. For example, Abraham believed, and his faith was reckoned or credited to him as righteousness. That is, there was a covenant relationship that God established with Abraham because he believed. The law was not given for another 600 years. So the Old Testament is not simply a book of law to earn, but is a book of Abraham's faith, that covenant relationship. And now when we get to Exodus chapter 20, God is saying, if you are to be in relationship with me, this is how you should live. Now let's go back and review just a little bit what's gone on in the book of Exodus. God has raised Moses up to deliver Israel from the Egyptian bondage and to take them to the promised land. He is Yahweh, keeping that promise, that covenant promise he made to Abraham over 600 years before. Moses and Aaron have confronted Pharaoh, asking that the Pharaoh allow the Egyptians to take that 3-day journey into the wilderness to worship Yahweh. Not only did the Pharaoh deny them that permission, but he made their life more strenuous. He made their work more onerous. Then, using Aaron and Moses as his instruments, God brought those 10 plagues on Egypt. Each time Pharaoh would if he did agree to allow them to leave, he would change his mind until we get to that 10th plague. And of course, that 10th plague was the killing of the firstborn in every household that was not marked by the blood of the Passover lamb. That is, all the Egyptian households lost their firstborn, and with that, Pharaoh sent the people of Israel, sent the Hebrews away, told them to leave. And then, of course, as God indicated he would, Pharaoh changed his mind and began to follow the children of Israel as they were leaving. Of course, we know they got to that point where they were trapped on one side by the Red Sea or the Sea of Reeds, whatever body of that water it was, but it was a body of water that prevented them from going further. And on the other side, there was the Egyptian army chasing them. And then God performed that miracle of drying up the Red Sea, allowing them to march across on dry land. And then as the Egyptian army chased them into that area that had been sea bottom, the bottom of the Red Sea, the waters closed back on them and completely destroyed the Egyptian army. So now the children of Israel have seen plagues. Now they've seen the parting of the waters, dry land, and then the destruction of the entire army of Egypt. Well, as they were making their way forward, going toward Mount Sinai there across that peninsula, God provided for them. When they didn't have water, and then they finally found some water, but it was bitter, God provided the means to make it drinkable. When they mumbled and grumbled about not having enough to eat, we said they were anticipating starvation, not that they were there yet. Anticipating starvation, they mumbled and grumbled, and God provided them meat, quail, and bread, manna. God has again provided for them. When they go on a little further and they can't find water, God provides through Moses water from the rock, by Moses striking the rock. And then as they made their way a little further, they are attacked by the Amalekites, and God gives Israel a victory over the Amalekite army. And so now here they are in their third month of traveling, and they're approaching Mount Sinai. This is in chapter 19. And let's take a minute and look in a little more detail at what happens here as a setting for chapter 20. When they get to Mount Sinai, Moses goes up to the top of the mountain to meet with God, and God gives him instructions for the people. Exodus 19:4-6 reads, You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings. This is what Moses was to tell the people of Israel. You've seen what God did to Egypt, and carried you on eagle's wings, and brought you to myself, God saying. Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all of the nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites. So God has given Moses a message and said, folks, if you will keep God's commands and maintain this covenant relationship that he's established with Abraham and the patriarchs, if you will maintain this covenant relationship with God, he will make you a nation of priests. That is, you will be his representatives to a pagan world and show them what living for Yahweh means. And you will be a holy people. You will be a holy nation. You will be separated, distinctive, different. You will reflect the very nature of God, of Yahweh himself. This was the promise he made to them, conditioned upon if you will keep my commands. He was offering to make a covenant with them. He was offering to be that covenant partner with them if they would obey. And the people agreed. When they heard the message from God delivered by Moses in Exodus 18:8, they responded, we will do everything the Lord has said. So Moses takes the answer back to God. God then tells Moses that he will speak to him, Moses, from a cloud, so that all the people of Israel will believe in Moses. At God's instruction, Moses goes down and tells the people they need to prepare for their meeting with God. They need to consecrate themselves, and they go through their cleansing and their consecration, and they are restricted from touching the mountain where God's presence is to be located. And then, having gone through this consecration, then God appears. Exodus chapter 19, verse 16. On the morning of the third day, there was thunder and lightning with a thick cloud over the mountain and a very loud trumpet blast. Everyone in the camp trembled. Then Moses led the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Mount Sinai was covered with smoke because the Lord descended on it in fire. The smoke billowed up from it like smoke from a furnace, and the whole mountain trembled violently. As the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and the voice of God answered him. So God speaks out of this cloud of smoke from the mountainside to Moses, and the people hear that. God then called Moses to come back up on the mountain for some more instructions for the people. gives him the instructions, and then he sends him back down the mountain. And Exodus 19:25 tells us Moses went down and told the people. He went down to the people and told them what they should do. It is now with Moses back down with the people, having been up to get the instructions from God, that chapter 20 opens. Now, chapter 20 is the description of the giving of the Ten Commandments. We begin there. Let me read a couple of verses out of chapter 20. And God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. They understood this was God speaking. They actually hear God speaking from the mountain. Now, it's not as clear here as it is when we read the second account of the giving of the Ten Commandments. Remember, Deuteronomy, by its name, means the second giving of the law. And what happens is in Deuteronomy, it is repeated. The description of the giving of the Ten Commandments is repeated. In that second time that it's described, Deuteronomy 5:22, listen to what the description of the giving of the Ten Commandments reads like. These are the commandments the Lord proclaimed in a loud voice to your whole assembly. This is Moses talking to his people. There on the mountain from out of the fire, the cloud and the deep darkness. And he added nothing more. Then he wrote them on 2 stone tablets and gave them to me. So when Moses is describing the giving of the Ten Commandments at a later time, he vividly describes that the people are standing at the foot of the mountain. There is smoke on the side of the mountain. And God speaks they hear the voice of God speaking. So, in Exodus chapter 20, verse 1, and God spoke. They recognized this was God speaking to them. This was not Moses speaking. This was God speaking to them, giving them the instructions. And God identifies himself. He says, I am the Lord your God. God spoke all these words. Let me stop right there. The term, the Hebrew term, that we translate in the English as words, has a technical meaning. This word in the Hebrew was a technical term that refers to the stipulation of a contract or stipulations of a covenant or the terms of a covenant, if you will. So he says God spoke all these words, and what he specifically is describing are the terms of the agreement. I will be your God, and you will live for me this way. This is the way you manifest covenant relationship. This is how he didn't say, I will, if you do this, by doing this, you will earn relationship. No, he said we're in relationship. And as a member of this covenant, as a party of this covenant, this is how you should live. This is the mark of righteousness, not the means to righteousness. This is how you should live in accordance with our agreement. And of course, he's referring to the Ten Commandments. Then he identifies himself. I am the Lord, and notice how the word Lord there is spelled. Again, it's translated, it is a translation of the Hebrew word Yahweh. I am Yahweh, your God. Okay, now remember, there are lots of gods in that day and time. The pagans had all kinds of gods. He says, I am Yahweh, your God. Using the term Yahweh immediately brings to their mind the God who spoke to Abraham, the God who made a covenant with Abraham, the God who promised Abraham that he would come back and deliver Abraham's descendants and give them the very land to possess that Abraham only lived in as a stranger. This is the promise-making God, the promise-keeping God. This is the God that spoke to Moses in the burning bush that they've heard about. Yahweh, I am Yahweh. And he says, and just as I made a promise, I kept my promise. How? I'm the one who brought you out of Egypt. I am the one that brought you out of the land of slavery. This idea of deliverance, this idea of deliverance from bondage carries with it the implications of the Savior. I am your Savior. I am the one. You didn't come out of Egypt under your own strength. You didn't come out of Egypt because you were so smart or so strong. In fact, it was only because of those 10 plagues, the drying of the Red Sea, the destruction of the Egyptian army, all at the hands of God, that you have your freedom. So he says, I am the God, I am Yahweh, who has your Savior, the one who has delivered you. Now he says, this is who I am. And now he is speaking to them, and he's going to give to them what we call the 10 Commandments. Now let's stop right there, because we may not be as familiar with some of this, and just to make sure that should you be talking with your friends, you understand where they're coming from, let me explain a couple things. First of all, different denominational groups count the 10 Commandments in different ways. Now, yeah, they all say there's 10, but they identify them differently. For example, in the Lutheran tradition and the Catholic tradition, verses 2 through 6 are considered the first commandment. And then verse 17, the commandment on covetousness, is divided into 2 commandments. So they have 10 commandments, but they count them a little differently. Modern Judaism considers verse 2, God identify himself, as the first commandment. And then they see verses 3 through 6 as the second commandment. Okay? Most Protestant churches and the Eastern Orthodox Church, we identify verse 3 as commandment 1 and verses 4 through 6 as the second commandment. So you see different groups count them differently. They put the verses together differently, but they all come up with 10 commandments. Now, Protestants consider verses 1 through 4, commandments 1 through 4, as those that are related to relationship with God. And sometimes some suggest, and those first 4 were written on one tablet, and then commandments 5 through 10 were written on the second tablet. That's why Moses had 2 tablets. Some Jewish scholars suggest that the 5th commandment, honoring your father and mother, is really related to the first 4. That is, God created man and woman and created the process of childbirth, and therefore by honoring your father and your mother, you are paying a tribute to God. Therefore it belongs in the first tablet with those commandments related to the relationship with God. Again, just a difference in perspective. Let's look at these briefly, commandment by commandment. You shall have no other gods before me. From our Protestant tradition, that is commandment 1. There were lots of other gods. The pagans had many different gods they worshiped. And they had idols that they worshiped as representations of their gods. Now, look what he says. You shall have no other gods before me. Now, some would say, oh, that means you can worship the other gods as long as Yahweh is your top priority. No, that's not a fair representation. The word before, you shall have no other gods before me. The Hebrew word that we translate before really carries implications of hostility or rival. Now, some would say, you will have no other gods, worship no other gods in my sight. That would mean before. But in the Hebrew technical sense of the word, it means you are not to have any other gods that rival me, or stand in contradiction to me, or stand along beside me. So he's not saying you can worship other gods as long as Yahweh is number 1. He's saying you're not to have any other gods, period. You're not to worship any other gods at all. Commandment 1. Commandment 2. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or in the earth beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. For I, the Lord, Yahweh, your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. Now he says, you're not to make an idol, and you're not to bow down to it. Now, this was not simply limited to making an idol that represented a pagan god. This was not simply to duplicate the idols that the pagans worship. He said, you're not to make any idol at all and worship it. You're not even to make an idol a physical representation of Yahweh. Now, of course, this is, we know what's going to be the downfall of Israel centuries later, when Jeroboam builds the golden calf in Dan and in Bethel as representations of Yahweh, violation of this commandment. But he said, you're not to make an idol at all and bow down to it. Now, because the pagans were so prone to worshiping nature, a lot of their idols were made in the forms of of items of nature. The commandment here is very inclusive. Notice what he says. You are not to make an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or on earth beneath, or in the waters below. Now, when you take the heaven, the earth, and the waters, that's all of creation. You're not to make it. Now, let me stop right there. It is not making painting a picture or sculpturing something that represents an item of creation that is wrong. It is when you worship it as a god that becomes wrong. In other words, an artist that paints a beautiful sunset, or the sculptor who forms a sculpture of a fierce lion, that can be a beauty of art. It's not wrong to make that art, but it's when then you bow down to it and worship it. That's what he says. You're not to make any image. You shall not bow down to worship them. For I, the Lord your God, am jealous God. What does that mean? He's jealous. And in our culture, the word jealous carries with it some negative connotations. And we may say, ooh, that doesn't sound, well, understand the word jealous also means zealous. Now, zealous has a little more of a positive connotation. I have great zeal. I have great commitment. I have great loyalty. He says, I am a zealous God. Now, what he's saying is I have made a covenant with you. I am making a covenant with you. I am entering fellowship with you. And I'm really committed to this. And I'm really zealous about our maintaining this relationship. In other words, God has wholeheartedly committed himself, and we think of this in our human terms, but he has wholeheartedly committed himself to this relationship. And he wants his people to likewise be wholeheartedly committed to this relationship. And one of the ways they demonstrate their wholehearted commitment to this relationship is by following these commandments. One commentator wrote it this way: God's jealousy is love in action. He refuses to share the human heart with any rival, not because he's selfish and wants us all for himself, but because he knows that upon that loyalty to him depends our very moral life. God is not jealous of us. He is jealous for us. He knows that it is only as we have that wholehearted commitment to the relationship, even in our daily lifestyle, that we maintain that commitment to him. And that's the commitment he wants from us, that wholehearted commitment. Now, in the terms of keeping a covenant, the words love and hate have a specific meaning. In the term of a covenant relationship, to love the other means to keep the covenant, to keep the relationship, to maintain the faithful commitment to the relationship. To hate the other means to turn your back on the covenant relationship. So it's not necessarily saying that those who shake their fist in God's face, and that's not hate. Hate is simply to turn your back and walk away from the relationship. So what does he say? He says, I'm a jealous God. I'm a zealous God. I want your wholehearted commitment. And he says, I punish the children for the sin of the parents down to the third and fourth generation. Now this is, some misread this. This is not suggesting a parent turns his back on God, so therefore God automatically punishes the third and fourth generation. That's not what he's saying. What he's saying is this. He's recognizing this. In that day and time, extended families lived together, and the senior male, the patriarch, had great influence on all the descendants, even down to the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren. They're all living in the same household. And when the senior male turns his back on the relationship, it is very, very likely that his children, his grandchildren, his great-grandchildren are also going to turn their back. And he says, I will punish the one who turns his back, and those who follow him down to third and fourth generations, those are the ones who are likely going to follow him. But then he turns around and says, but I show love to 1,000 generations of those who love me. Those who keep the commandments. He shows his favor and his love down through 1,000 generations. His love is enduring. His offer of relationship is enduring forever. His punishment comes and passes. And we'll see that in the life of Israel. He punished them, but then he restores them. But his love for them never ends. So he's assuring us, yes, you turn your back and there is punishment, but that passes. But when you love me, my blessings on you last forever. Okay. That's the second commandment. You shall have no other gods before me. Number one, not make yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven or earth or beneath, and then bow down to it. I am the Lord your God, a jealous God, punishing the children of the sin for the sin of the parents down to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. Then the third commandment, verse 7. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name. Now many have interpreted this to mean profanity, and they would limit this to you shouldn't use the Lord's name as a part of profanity. Some suggest that the original meaning of this was meant to take a false oath, to swear to the truth on God's name and then to tell a lie. But we also understand this means to be hypocrisy. When you say you are one thing, but you live another way, you're using God's name in vain. You're using it in a useless way. You're using it in a casual way, and that would violate it. To use God's name to try to justify or explain something that's not related to God, that would be misusing his name. Hypocrisy, though, is probably the way so many people violate this commandment without even thinking about it. When they proclaim themselves to be of faith and their lifestyle is such that it shows they're not committed to God, that contradicts what they say, and that's a misuse of God's name. Okay, the fourth commandment, verses 8 through 11. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son, nor daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, or any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. This is still talking about man's relationship to God, but this also has an aspect of man's relationship to other men. Um, God made heaven and earth 6 days. On the seventh he rested. So therefore man should, in reflecting God, keep this day separate, distinct, holy, different. What's going on? When man rests on the seventh day, he not only is following God's pattern, but he's saying, I trust God. Man in his humanness is always trying to make sure everything is just so. And sometimes it means I've got to work every day just to make sure I have enough to keep. And he said, no. Once in a while, Sabbath day, rest. Take your hands off. Release. Let God take control. Acknowledge God is in control. Now, there are great human benefits from this, we realize. In the humanness, we've determined there is a need for this time of rest. But it is acknowledging that God is in control. It is our commitment to God that leads us to treat this one day special. Now, this is the commandment that has a reason. He gives us a reason. He says, if God can create everything in 6 days and rest on the seventh, you likewise. He made the seventh day special. He made the seventh day different. It was a time of rest. You likewise should follow that pattern. Now, in the second giving of the law, when Moses recounts the law a second time over in Deuteronomy, Moses says that this law, it is suggested that this Sabbath was to acknowledge Yahweh's deliverance of the people of Israel from the Egyptian bondage. So this Sabbath was not only modeling God's creative practice, but it was also an acknowledgement, this is the God who brought us out of Egypt. We depended upon him at that time. We can depend upon him now. Keep it holy. Keep it a Sabbath to the Lord, acknowledging the sovereignty of the Lord, the sovereignty of God, the sovereignty of Yahweh. And we can rest on that day in full confidence that he's in control and that he will take care of us. Now, recognize, when you do this, you will be living countercultural today and back then. This was one of the distinctive marks of the Jewish people in a pagan world, of the Hebrew people in a pagan world, and it still is. This distinguishes you. This makes you different. Keep it holy, different, not normal, not ordinary, not profane. Keep it holy. This is one of those distinguishing marks. This would then be, as the people of Israel, the Hebrews, would go march into these foreign nations and these pagan nations, and they kept this law, they would be different. They would be a nation of priests. They would be showing them the difference of what it means to be in a relationship with Yahweh, as opposed to worship those pagan idols that they worship. When we get down to verse 12, again, this is the one that in the Protestant tradition we placed with the commandments that are related to other men, relationship with other men, but some of the Jewish scholars say, no, this belongs with the first four in relationship to God. Honor your father and mother so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God is giving you. Now, honor your father and mother. To honor means to give weight to. It means to ascribe weight to regard as important, to treat as valuable, to care for. Okay? This wasn't just for children, this was for adults too, honoring their adult parents. Now, notice that it's honor your father and mother. This would mark the Hebrews as different, because remember, in that day and time, the female was considered to be inferior. But this commandment says honor your father and mother in equal terms. So this would mark them as different. Honor your father and mother. And he gives a benefit that comes from keeping this commandment. but that benefit is understood a couple different ways. One, it says that you may live long in the land your God has given you. That you may live long may mean so that you personally will have a long life. That would be a blessing that would come from honoring your father and mother. But it's also read by some scholars to say, no, this is referring to that the nation of Israel may have a long existence in the land. In other words, speaking to them as a nation, so that you as a nation would, keeping God's commandments, would maintain relationship, and God would continue to provide for you that promised land that he's giving to you. And breaking these commandments then destroys relationship, and we saw what happened. In fact, the 10 tribes of the north were scattered by the Assyrians. Judah was scattered in Babylon by the Babylonians. That was a result of their failure to keep the commands. The promise was, if you'll keep the commands, your nation will have long life in the land that God is giving you. Verses 13 through 16 now talk about specific relationship with other people and community, and it gives them in the order of seriousness of violation. You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. Verse 13, murder. Now this is not an absolute prohibition on any killing, because we know that God instructs the children of Israel to kill the pagans when they invade their land. But what this is talking about is the taking of another's life without proper justification. And of course, we may have some serious argument about what proper justification is. But let's not stop here. Let's think also about what Jesus said. Because Jesus takes this physical act to a step further, and he says, it's not only that you are not to physically kill someone else, but it goes to your attitude. When there is hatred in your heart, you've violated the commandment. So he's talking about our respecting the life and reputation of other people, the attitude of the heart. Adultery, unlawful sexual relations by a married person. It's not only a sin against the spouse, but it's also a sin against God. Jesus took this again from physical act to attitude. When you so much as have lust in your heart, you violated the commandment. The crux of the issue is keeping your marriage vow. The crux of the issue is you are to honor the commitments to your spouse as a commandment of God. To not steal, referring to the respect for the property, the tangible property of other people. Not give false testimony. We sometimes limit this to just simply talking about testimony in court, but it goes beyond that. It's just not just false testimony in court, but this would be gossip. This would be any kind of slander, libel, any kind of informal forum where you may say something about somebody else that you know is not true, or say something about them that is questionable and you don't know if it's true or not. This is the false testimony against your neighbor. And then the last commandment in the Protestant tradition is you shall not covet your neighbor's house, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male or female servant, his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. The word covet is talking about your desire for what they have. Now the others, the murder, the adultery, the steal, the false testimony, these are all talking about behavior, acts. But covet goes to the attitude. It goes to the heart. It says you are not to covet. Now the word covet means to pant after. It's a desire for something that leads to an improper response, an evil motivation. It's not only to see something and admire it, but then to become obsessed with having it. That's what covetousness is talking about. One commentator wrote it this way. Covetousness works like this. The eyes look upon an object, the mind admires it, the will goes over to it, the body moves to possess it. Just because you have not taken the final step does not mean you are not in the process of coveting right now. So it's not only the act of possessing it, taking it, but it's when you admire it, you want it, and you're moved to possess it with an evil desire. It's become something you've got to have. Now, it's interesting because it says, you shall not covet your neighbor's house, an object. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife. Now remember, in that day and time, the female was considered an object. The wife was a man's possession. So saying to men, you are not to covet the possession of your neighbor, whether it be his house, his animal, or his wife. Again, an attitude that betrays that wholehearted commitment to God as a member, in relationship, in right relationship, in covenant relationship with Him. Well, this is a brief summary of the way God asks His people to live in covenant relationship. We want to close our lesson time with some scripture from Paul over in Romans chapter 13. In Romans chapter 13, verses 6 to 7, Paul has been discussing about what it means to pay your taxes, giving proper respect to civil authority. In verse 6, Paul wrote, "This is also why you pay taxes, for authorities are God's servants who gave their full time to governing. Give to everyone give to everyone what you owe them. If you owe them taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor." So now, having just talked about paying your debts, paying what you owe people, Paul then moves to verse 8, and he says, "Let no debt remain outstanding," right along with what he's been saying, "except the continuing debt to love one another. For he who loves his fellow man has fulfilled the law. The commandments, do not commit adultery, do not murder, do not steal, do not covet, and whatever other commandment there may be, are summed up in one rule: love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to its neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law." Paul here is giving us a summary of the Old Testament law, the Ten Commandments, from a New Testament perspective. He says, pay all your debts except the debt of love. That is a continuing, ongoing debt. Why? Because he says to love your neighbor is the fulfillment of the law. In other words, if you do all these things that the Ten Commandment calls for in Commandments 5 through 10, you will love your neighbor. That is, he says, and he quotes them. He says, murder, adultery, stealing, coveting. He said, and whatever other commandment there may be. All of these are summed up in one law: love your neighbor. What is your neighbor? And when you do love your neighbor, you have fulfilled the law. You have fulfilled that which God has asked you to do to maintain your covenant relationship with Him. Now, when he uses you quote there, love your neighbor as yourself, this is an echo from Leviticus 19:18. Do not seek revenge or bear grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbor yourself. I am the Lord. Paul summarizes it there in verse 10. Love does no harm to his neighbor. Murder, steal, adultery, covetousness. Love is the fulfillment of the law. Remember what Jesus said there in Matthew 22, verse 37 through 40. When asked, he replied, Love the Lord with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. So we summarize the law, the instruction God gave to his people. Love the Lord with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Don't have any idols, don't have any gods before him. Don't make any idols. Don't misuse his name. Honor his commitments, his commandments, the Sabbath. And love your neighbor as yourself. And when you keep those two laws, loving God with all your heart, loving your neighbor as yourself, you have kept the Ten Commandments. The law has been fulfilled. Paul later talks about that it is by our loving our neighbors that the righteous requirements of the law are fulfilled. Well, God made a covenant with Israel, and he was faithful to keep that covenant. And even when Israel failed to keep the covenant, he still loved them. Punishment came because he told them, if you don't keep my covenant, punishment will come. And he kept his promise. But his love extended through thousands of generations and brought them back. And we know that is the history of the Old Testament. And then he kept his promise. The promises made through the prophets of the coming of one, the Messiah. Jesus has come. And through our faith in Jesus Christ, we are offered that righteousness, that covenant relationship with God. But likewise, we are to live a life that reflects that covenant relationship. And how is how are those rules summarized? Love your neighbor as yourself. This is the fulfillment of the righteous requirements of the law. So through Moses God said to the children of Israel, he still says to us, and summarizes and gives us an understanding of that through Jesus Christ's example of love for us, and through Paul's instructions that we love our neighbor. That is the fulfillment of the law. Well, this week, how will I be a priest to my pagan world? And that's what God said, as we keep the commandments, as we obey and maintain covenant relationship, we would be a priest to a pagan world. How will we be a holy people, different, separated? Do our actions look so much like everyone else that no one would realize? Or, as the cliche says, if you were put on trial this week for being a Christian, what evidence would they have against you? Love your neighbor. So totally countercultural to the world in which we live. But as Paul said, this is the fulfillment of the law. God instructs his people. Old Testament? Yes. Again in the New Testament through Jesus Christ's life, teachings, his model, and through the opportunity provided by his death, the atoning sacrifice. We can have covenant relationship. And living in this covenant, we are transformed so that we are enabled and equipped to fulfill the righteous requirements of the law. We can live a life this week in a pagan world that reflects the love that God has for his people, that Christ had for us, that took him to the cross. We can practice that love. Let's pray. Father, we realize that this week we're going to encounter situations that will challenge us. But may, through every circumstance we meet, you enable us and equip us that we might be a nation of priests to a pagan world, a holy people showing what it means to be in covenant relationship with God. We thank you for your faithfulness in keeping your promises. And we thank you for your promise that you would not call us to do something, but that you would equip us and enable us. And we at this time open ourselves to you and simply ask, thy kingdom come, thy will be done in my life this week. For it's in the name of the one who called us, Jesus the Christ, we pray.